Today we're talking about back to school exchanges, and we know that this looks a little bit different for every single school district across the world right now as COVID-19 flexes and changes. And so what we're going to do today is talk a little bit about really leaning on cultural values, so trust, inclusivity, and then offer a variety of options for exchanges, so really specific exchange types that you can run, and then leave space for questions at the end. And as always, we're going to welcome you to join the conversation about Thoughtexchange and what you learned today on social media. So use the hashtag TEVE or hashtag TEMasterclass to let us know what you learned and if you have any questions. I'll get started by introducing myself. So my name is Tila Beischer. If you've attended one of our master classes before, you've seen me. I host this series every Monday morning, and I'm a customer success manager here. So I partner primarily with our education leaders to help them plan and execute exchanges. So right now I'm working on quite a few of these exchanges, and we're also seeing a large trend of them across all of our thought partners. And I really support with things like onboarding, training, adoption, and really thinking critically about where are we at as an organization or as a district, and what's the conversation that we need to have. And so I also want to point out on this slide our community. So we host these virtual events. They're every Monday, and we do also offer getting started workshops on Thursdays if you want to refresh yourself on exchange design skills. And we have a really robust help site with lots of video tutorials. There's a chat support built in, and then you also have your dedicated Thoughtexchange team. So here's what we're talking about today. We're going to do 4 things in our masterclass. We'll talk about how you can use Thoughtexchange to build inclusivity and trust with your stakeholders, while also making your planning process a little bit more efficient as you work to create that safe return to learning for your students and your staff. Then we're going to talk about how practically to use something that we call the hierarchy of questions to inform your exchange design. Then we'll talk about iterative exchange design, which you've probably heard that word before in one of these events, but it's the concept of running exchanges based on what came up in previous exchanges, or acknowledging that we might need to run a series of exchanges to get an answer to a question. And then we're going to talk about working with results. So what are those tools in your Discover dashboard that are going to be the most important? And we'll wrap up with a Q&A. And before I get started, I do really want to acknowledge that this process is going to look different for each of you that are on the call. Some districts already have their plan in place and are ready to start. Some are starting within a couple weeks, starting in August, and up here in Canada, we're starting a little bit later, mid-September. And so with that in mind, what I want to ensure that you have today is an understanding of the fact that you can use exchanges in all manners of this planning and implementation process. An exchange doesn't have to be a large, huge exchange. It can be something smaller. It can be, you can use it to guide a meeting agenda with a task force. And wherever your district is at in the process, we're really acknowledging that there's a lot of fear and uncertainty about this return to schools in district communities right now. And so for you as a leader, your objective with these exchanges is to really bring that into the open and to have the opportunity to address it and to heal that together, to be really courageous and have transparent leadership so that you can foster that culture of trust and start addressing the base level need for psychological and physical safety in your community. And so kind of thinking about that as where you're at right now, you're looking at either doing distance learning, hybrid learning, maybe back to school physically, but we're seeing a lot of disagreement, mistrust, and fear guiding a lot of the public discourse around this conversation. And so the changes to learning impact every single one of your stakeholders, your students, your staff, you, parents, even community members and families. And so really transforming that leadership, the challenges of this is all focused on safety and also keeping people in the loop. And so leaders like you, you're all tackling this at the same time right now too, and attending to your usual challenges, your usual return to school planning, while also trying to keep your district stable and moving forward. And you need to accomplish this in a way that aligns with your values. And so what I'm going to say is that crowdsourcing is the opportunity right now to complete that in a way that meets all of those values. So it's efficient, it allows you to address safety, to build that grouping of coming together, and it allows you to really be strategic and create a plan with a lot of data to back you up. And that's a really good reason why the use of Thought Exchange doubled. That doubled number is a little bit older, but I think we've gone up even further. But the first 30 days of the pandemic, our usage has doubled and even grown further because our leaders know that they need to make informed decisions really quickly, and they urgently need to hear from your people, and your people need to know that they're being heard and cared for. And crowdsourcing in this way really brought our leaders some significant gains, such as an understanding of the challenges faced by their employees in their schools, that their students and their families are facing. So getting really clear on what are those challenges and how could we address them. And then being able to respond appropriately. And so once you know how people are truly thinking and what that local knowledge is saying, you're able to build your plan to address that. And a really good example of that is the whole state of Connecticut actually ran an exchange recently, and they changed direction and decided to keep their schools closed for the remainder of last school year. And they're looking at using that information to inform their return to school planning once they heard from their people. So they were able to use their people's guidance in order to clarify that plan. And then also these leaders are able to gain trust because people know that they're being heard. And if you've come to a Thought Exchange event before, you've talked with us about building trust. And the really practical how-to of building trust is to demonstrate deep listening, courageous listening, brave listening, you could call it, and then to also be responsive to the feedback that's gathered and take action. And so the exchange is your opportunity to demonstrate that deep listening, to be active in the conversation, and to be vulnerable. And then when you're responding to the exchange, doing things practically like sharing summary reports, having public forums to talk about results, or including the fact in any action that you initiate as a result of the exchange, referencing back to, we heard this come up in our exchange, then it starts to demonstrate to your stakeholders that you're acting and that those listening isn't just an exercise in listening, it's actually an exercise in ownership. So people become more motivated to participate in future exchanges. So here we have the hierarchy of questions, which is similar to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, but we've applied it to the concept of doing question design or exchange design for crowdsourcing. And this really provides a way of thinking about putting Thought Exchange to work. And so you know where your district is at, and then what conversation do you need to have as a result. And so really similar to what Maslow identified in his hierarchy of needs, the hierarchy of question reminds leaders to consider safety and security issues to ensure that people are feeling safe before you begin to address some of the higher levels. So starting with safety before you move on to visioning or transforming. And a really good example of that is right now, because people are feeling physically unsafe, an exchange allowing them to express their needs for safety, and then for you to iterate and communicate what the plans are in place to protect your students, staff, and community will be a really good starting point. Whereas you can imagine if you started with, for example, up at the top, this culture one, how has our culture changed as a result of this? People would probably just start talking about safety because they need to start at the bottom of the pyramid and build up. Another thing that you can think about in this hierarchy as you're implementing it into your workflow for exchange design is that it can be a guide to thinking about a change process, as it prompts you to consider the impacts and implications of a particular change. So for example, if your school district is starting with remote learning, you might be implementing new policies or maybe a new system for distance learning. And running an exchange about the new system will let you measure its efficacy. So you'll be able to measure the change progresses, efficiencies, maybe things that you need to change. And you could do that for staff, for parents, for students. And then you can also look at what is the cultural effect of the change. So has it helped people to feel safe? Has it helped people to feel that their social and emotional needs are met? Has it helped students to start meeting those learning outcomes and to be building more connections together? And so when you think about change process, it's always the dual. It's how effective is the change and how is it impacting us culturally? The hierarchy also prompts us to consider the time and the nature of our outreach, and that's really significant right now. And so if you're thinking again, if you're reaching out about transformation, but you need to have a conversation about safety first, the conversation will naturally shift to safety. So this is a good reminder to involve people where they're at. And in practice, if you're thinking about where am I, where is my district on this hierarchy of questions, think about what exchanges that you've already ran and what are those communications already like in your district. Does your community need to start at the bottom, or have you already addressed that? Does your staff need to talk about goals for maintaining their culture through shifts in working styles? Or do you want to allow students to have more of a voice and to allow the students to guide that innovation and connection? Consider really honestly where your district is at on this pyramid and start there. And I think that this pyramid also really speaks strongly to the concept of iterative exchange design. So one exchange is never going to give you all of the information for each step of this process. And if you think about change management best practices, you do need to go through all of these different steps when you think about implementing a new policy, a new way of learning, a new way of working. And so don't be afraid to be running multiple exchanges. You can start at safety, move up to structure and process, look at people and connection as well. And then look as well at alignment. Don't be afraid to be doing these again and again and again. If you frame your exchange structure as we're going to be running a series of exchanges to build upon what we're learning together, and use words like we want to hear more. In your introductions for your future exchanges, reference back to the past one. So maybe you're running one about structure and process. You've already ran an exchange about safety, and now you're ready to talk about what is the platform for distance learning that you're using. Maybe you could say in your introduction, in our safety exchange, we heard X and we actually built an FAQ. Click here if you want to learn more. But in this exchange, we're wanting to talk about now that we've decided to do distance learning as a result of the safety exchange, what else do we need to know? And so that's your way to build continuity in language amongst the different exchanges. And what I want to do too is offer you some really practical questions that you can use. So you understand the framework of the hierarchy of questions, and now these are the questions that you could actually use, and I'll be sure to send you these in a follow-up. And these are ones that district leaders have actually used too. And as I've described already, the impact of COVID-19 really necessitates a focus on the bottom of the hierarchy. And once you've addressed that and really built some stabilization, then you can start to reimagine and move upwards towards vision and transformation. What we're anticipating is that we're focusing on safety and security and structure and process for now, for the period of planning, and then the period of the start of execution of the new school year. And once people are a little bit settled in and a little bit more used to that process, then you can start moving upwards too. And so let me read through some of these questions just so that you kind of hear them verbally and think about how could these impact my schools. So our safety and security question is, what concerns, questions, or ideas should we consider when planning to reopen schools? Structure and process, we're thinking about what thoughts and questions do you have about our draft reopening plan? So maybe that's something that you've put together the plan using state guidance, using your local knowledge, using the feedback from your safety and security exchange, and you've shared it out and now you want to gather feedback and make edits to it. Or you created that exchange or the plan maybe before some changes in transmission rates in your area or your region. So you really need to get a sense of exactly where people are at now. And what I love about this is that you could think about using that at something like a town hall. And so if you're actually running town halls or online events to familiarize people with the plans, embedding an exchange within that can be a really powerful way to gather a lot of feedback and invite a lot of energy into that event with all while maintaining efficiency. So if you haven't used an exchange live in the room yet, it's really easy to do, and we do have a masterclass on how to host it that we'll embed in the follow-up too. And so we've added some further examples to this slide as well. So you can see we have things like vision and purpose. Vision and purpose are going to change as a result. Obviously, student learning is the most important thing that we want to focus on, safety, but if we're learning more online, how can we adjust our vision to be really inclusive to those vulnerable students, to be inclusive to those students that are excelling up beyond their grade level too, to make sure that nothing gets missed. And then, oh, so sorry about that. My mouse just shifted us all the way up to the end of our presentation. We'll go back here. So we can think too about transformation as well. And I do really want to acknowledge that you're completing this work amidst a global call for anti-racism and an awakening of that as well. And so thinking about the return to school, that might be another component of safety and security that comes up. So if you have not yet engaged about that, we've ran a few events talking about it. You can find recordings of it on our site. And I'm also going to add a resource to the chat here with some of our suggestions for questions and things to consider for anti-racism exchanges, but it is something to think about as you're going through this process. If we flip back here to our pyramid, that would fall strongly under safety and security. People aren't feeling safe when it comes to equity and diversity and anti-racism. So how can you address that and bring that into a part of this conversation too? So our next thing to think about is we're really crisp on being where we're at. We're crisp on building iteratively, so knowing that we're going to move up amongst that hierarchy. But how do you think about including your functions in the Discover dashboard within that? And that is thinking about how are you planning your exchanges with your results in mind. And so you should always be planning your exchanges with an understanding of how do I ultimately need to understand and action upon this and really ensure that the results and the data that I gather is operationalized. And so that might be things like thinking really strategically about how you design the exchange. Do you need to use survey questions to parse your data? Or do you need to use participant groups to actually segment the conversations? And I would think about that. A really good example could be if you're thinking about your stakeholders for a return to school exchange, and how is your community doing in terms of parent and teacher relationships? I know that right now this can be really fraught. There was a lot of frustration at the end of last school year with distance learning and a lot of misinformation. And so would it hurt teachers' feelings if they heard comments from parents? If so, maybe you want to separate and use participant groups. So you have all your teachers in one section and all of your parents in the other, and they would all be just talking to each other. But if you think that building that transparency, that vulnerability, and really leveraging that empathy that people produce as a result of participating in the exchanges, maybe survey questions are the way to go. So you have a survey question asking them their role in your district. And ultimately, when you're looking at your Discover dashboard, you're going to be able to parse your thoughts, your themes. You're going to be able to use those differences and heat maps tools all to understand what is the most important thing to all of the different stakeholders within your district. Another thing that I would recommend for these exchanges is spending some time doing some custom theming work. And remember that theming is organizing your thoughts into groups or themes that everyone can understand. And there's two strategies I'm going to recommend for you here. One is to do high agreement theming. So looking at what are the emergent themes that come up within the highest rated thoughts. Maybe you look at the top 200 thoughts and you rate those to different categories based on what the topics are that you're seeing coming up. Another theme set that you can use that I've seen a couple districts use and be really successful is to look at your statewide recommendations for return to school and whatever the pillars are that they've asked you to consider, and then to do your theming according to that. And so a really good example of that is California right now is looking at doing a learning continuity and attendance plan. And with that, their state gave them some really clear guidelines on what are the things that they need to be measuring. So attendance, vulnerable students, professional development, distance learning offerings. And so if you were to think of building your themes into attendance, vulnerable students, distance learning offerings, or professional development and adding the thoughts, and then doing your reporting using that themes, it would streamline that work for you. And if you're wanting to learn more about how to really do that strategic theming, I've just popped a link into the chat here, and this is our theming masterclass. So it goes over how to actually do those two processes. The other area that I really want to highlight for you to explore as a leader in your dashboard is the differences tab. And differences is interesting for all exchanges, but it is particularly interesting for exchanges where there are groups of polarities, and we're really seeing that right now. So some people say, let's go back to school. We don't want any masks. we don't want any safety measures, our students need to go back to school. And then you're going to have that group of the opposite that's saying, I don't feel safe yet and I want to keep my kids at home still. What differences allows you to do is to see what are the thoughts that are building up those two groups. And actually it does give you a function to show where are these two groups coming together. So what are the things that they actually do agree upon? And oftentimes that's things like staff support, like making sure that student outcomes are achieved, and like making sure that learning is maintained too, and even social and emotional wellness too. And so that tool is one that I really encourage you to spend some time in. Make sure to ask some survey questions so you can break that apart too. And I will say that we do have a wonderful customer success manager team that can help you to plan those survey questions and think about designing your exchange to inform the ultimate way that you need to understand your results. And so what we're going to do now is we're actually going to move into a bit of a Q&A. We're going to run a quick exchange. There's not that many of us on the call today, so we should be able to do this pretty quickly and then go through all of your questions. So I'm actually going to hop here into my Thoughtexchange room. I'm going to zoom in and I'm going to use the Exchange Gallery. In case any of you haven't seen it yet, the Exchange Gallery is a resource of templated exchanges for you. You can see we have some anti-racism ones here. We're looking at mine, which is set up as corporate, but you'll see here, return to school. So you'll be able to click on that and then look at all of the return to school exchanges. And then for meetings here, events, I'm going to click on this here, presentations, and I'm going to ask you, what thoughts and questions do you have? Click on create exchange. I'm going to grab the link, click on present, click on present, and then I'm going to set a timer here and invite you all to hop in and share your questions. So we're going to spend 4 minutes doing this participation component. You can use the QR code or you can use the link in the chat, and please ask your questions there and then we'll take time to go through them. If we don't get to all of them, then I will create a leader report and send it to you as well. And as all of you know who have hosted these live exchanges during a virtual session, I'm going to put myself on mute so I'm not talking through your participation so you can have some quiet space. If you're having any issues getting into the exchange, just ping me in the chat and I will make sure that we can get you in there. All right, well, we have 4 minutes left and it looks like our thoughts are quieting down here. So let's actually stop the exchange here and let's move into the Discover view and walk through them. So great details. Thanks for your help in framing these exchanges. Thanks for attending. Really what we do is we look at research of how are people actually doing this work and then we put them together for you. So these are actually all of you and you as thought partners and thought leaders running these exchanges. What I will say too is that we'll follow up with those visuals. You can think about the hierarchy of questions. You can think about the hierarchy of needs too and how it implements your district or how it affects your district. And this one here, what do you find is the best approach to helping executive leaders work through fear of vulnerability? It's a really important question because you as the leader or you as the leader of Thoughtexchange within your district might be really well versed in this and maybe you're ready to go, but your other executive leaders aren't yet too. So what I find can really help is if you have the opportunity within your license or within your contract to let them lead an exchange, what they could do is actually perhaps run an exchange with your team about a topic that they want to ask about so that they get used to that process. Another component or another strategy that you can try is setting them up for some why or some crowdsourcing competency training with your customer success manager. What they do is they actually listen deeply to whatever your executive leader's concerns are about transparency in the district, listen for specific examples, and then offer ways to move through that in a really strategic and maybe slow way. So maybe you want to implement or roll out this process slowly with smaller exchanges building up to a large, or maybe you need to demonstrate to them a little by little exactly how that can be accomplished. So use us as your partners to do that work. You're not in that work on your own, and we do have some amazing resources. Another thing that we're happy to do is to connect you with other leaders who may have gone through the same thing. So they've had their executive team, their executive cabinet not buy into the concept of crowdsourcing the same way, and we can share that information with you so that they can really learn from their peers too. One other thing that I'll say before we move beyond this is that sometimes moving beyond the vulnerability and looking at the ROI or the value of the process can be another way to get your team to really buy into the idea of using crowdsourcing or Thoughtexchange. It's a faster process than most traditional stakeholder engagement methods, and your results are easier to understand and implement. Your reporting becomes more simple because you have all of these tools to support you. You have a data set that's already prioritized and ranked for you. So if that's their focus that they're thinking about, that can be another way to trigger some buy-in from your team. Our next one here, wondering what the largest participation rate in a COVID-related exchange. I'm not sure what the actual stats are on this, but we did have a few entirely statewide COVID-related exchanges. As I mentioned, the state of Connecticut ran an exchange, the state of New York ran an exchange too. And so those had tens of thousands of participants in them, huge and robust data sets. So if you're thinking of running something that large, I would recommend reaching out to your customer success manager for some support in planning. Participant groups might be really valuable for you in a larger exchange so that when you're looking at your results, you're able to parse them and to segment them a little bit more crisply. But I would say don't be afraid of running a huge exchange too, is that the more data that you gather, the more that you're able to implement. And it really does invite just more voices to the table and to allow them to experience that empathy building that participants get to have and the participant learning step that they get when they're rating each other's thoughts. All right, and the last one here is just a thanks for the session. Thank you for your time. I know we're a minute over. I'm going to follow up with all of these resources so that you have them available to you as well. And I will also mention too that we are having a masterclass next week, next Monday, on moderation. And so that's really important if you're going to be running any of those anti-racism or equity and diversity exchanges. Thinking about what's your moderation strategy is a really powerful way to build trust and to avoid censorship. So if you want to attend that, the link is on our website, just thoughtexchange.com. If you hover over events, there's a masterclasses registration page, and it's the same time, so 10 a.m. Pacific time and 1 p.m. Eastern time. And thank you so much for joining today. I really hope that it sparks some thinking, inspired some ideas for using exchanges along every single step of your return to school planning process. And just want to say thank you for doing this work on behalf of us, on behalf of your district communities. It's difficult work, and we're happy to be partnering with you on it. So thank you, and all of you have a wonderful rest of your week.